All right, everybody, I'm going to get started with an opening. We, again, are having a few technical difficulties getting our speaker, Janet McMahon, on, but I think we have a plan to have her still participate through my phone, and hopefully we'll test the sound quality and see if it works. If not, we'll have to rearrange the presentation a bit. But thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Protecting Maine's North Woods. My name is Krista Jackson. I'm the digital strategist at the Natural Resources Council of Maine. NRCM is Maine's leading nonpartisan membership organization dedicated to protecting Maine's environment. Since 1959, we have harnessed the power of science, the law, and the voices of our supporters statewide and beyond to protect the places and the way of life that makes Maine so special. If you'd like to learn more about becoming a member, you can visit our website at nrcm.org. And before we begin with today's presentation, we want to acknowledge that Maine's North Woods, like all of Maine, is on unceded Wabanaki territory. The Wabanaki nations have stewarded these lands for lands, waters, and wildlife for millennia. And at NRCM, we are committed to working alongside the Wabanaki nations in protecting these landscapes and supporting the effort to achieve state recognition of tribal sovereignty. Now, I'm excited to turn to today's discussion, which is protecting Maine's North Woods. Maine's North Woods is the largest undeveloped forest east of the Mississippi and is home to incredible wildlife habitats, clean rivers, lakes, and ponds, and some of the most iconic landscapes in our state. But this landscape faces increasing pressure from development, industrial activity, and climate change. And so today we'll be hearing more about how we can protect Maine's North Woods. We're planning to hear from three speakers. The first is Janet McMahon, local ecologist, who is an incredibly knowledgeable voice on the resources of the North Woods. Again, we're having a bit of a technical difficulty getting Janet connected. We're going to try showing her slides and going through the phone, and we'll see how that works out. And I'm hoping that it works for both parties. We'll see how it goes. And then we'll hear from Pete Didisheim, which is NRCM's Senior Director of Advocacy, on NRCM's history to protect this region, followed by Luke Frankel, NRCM's Woods, Waters, and Wildlife Director, on the current bills that we're working on to protect the North Woods. So with that, I'm going to switch over to Janet's slides. And Janet, are you still with me here?
I am.
Can y'all hear Janet? I'm getting some thumbs up, so I know, again, this is not ideal, Janet, but I think we're going to make it work. So okay. Let me switch over to your slides. And here they're up. I'm happy to advance them as we go, and we'll get started. Oops.
Okay. This is very strange, totally anonymous, but this is Janet McMahon speaking. And I've been working in Maine's forests. I'm an ecologist, a freelance ecologist, from Kittery up the Yankee Tulare, the very northernmost town, since I graduated from college 45 years ago. And most recently, I spent a couple of years doing an inventory of the Allagash watershed. And that gave me a chance to really take a close look at the forests now, compared to what I used to see. And there's a lot that's changed. The North Woods has come to be recognized as unique in the nation, even globally. And also during this time, it's undergone some profound changes. So I'm going to talk about both those things today. So next slide. So I'm assuming that the next slide is there.
It is, yeah. I will do my best to follow your cues. I know you can't see it.
Okay. So the North Maine Woods straddles the boundary between spruce fir northern hardwood forest, and then it transitions to northern boreal forest. And that transition occurs right in the heart of the forest, like in the southern Allagash and St. John watersheds. Next slide.
Yep.
And it's at the heart of the largest, most intact temperate forest in North America. That we refer to this region, ecologists do, as the Northern Appalachian Acadian ecoregion, that area in darker green. And the North Maine Woods is in the very heart of that. And it's the key ecological link between the Adirondacks and Maine, Western Maine Mountains, and the Gaspé Peninsula, as those arrows show. Next slide. And it includes the largest undeveloped region east of the Rocky Mountains. And it's considered one of the largest intact temperate forests in the world. And it extends basically from Katahdin to the St. John River, this area, the remote area that's shown there, and doesn't have any settlements, public or paved roads, industrial or agricultural development, mines, energy infrastructure, and utilities. So it stands out again at a national scale and even at an international scale. Next slide. So the National Audubon Society has mapped what they call globally important bird areas all over the world. And in the United States, the largest one is the North Maine Woods. And about half of the species that breed in Maine have been confirmed in the region, including all of the state's northern warblers, and also lots of wetland species. And it's of huge importance to migratory birds as well. Next slide. Compared to much of the country, the streams are remarkably clean and connected. This is Jemquassabamticook, which drains into the Allagash. And this is a tributary of the Allagash, and there's lots of tributaries that look like this, where there's still, sort of natural ecological functions are at play. Next slide. And the rivers are incredibly dynamic. They're impacted by spring freshet, ice scour, beavers, something that people refer to as active rivers with intact floodplains and an incredible diversity of wetlands. The North Maine Woods, most of the river tributaries of the main rivers look a lot like this. Next slide. And there's thousands of ponds and lakes. The shorelines of some are protected from development by conservation easements or remote pond designation, but the majority remain unprotected. But there's beautiful chains like this, the Musqueam Lake chain, which drains into the Allagash, which has no formal protection, but is almost completely undeveloped. Next slide. Because the streams and ponds of the North Maine Woods are largely undeveloped, excuse me, the water quality is exceptional. And they're cool temperatures because this is relatively far north. And this makes it the last stronghold for native brook trout in the eastern United States. Kristen, are we on the fish slide?
We are, yeah.
Okay. And there's also, it's the only place where there's 4 native cold water fish that occur together along with a variety of minnows. And again, it's because the waters are clean, clear, and still cool because of the northern latitude. And also one of my favorites, that big mound of rocks you see on the lower right, I believe, are made by fall fish, a minnow that creates a nest out of stones that can be 3 feet high and about 6 feet in diameter. So there's just a lot going on if you look carefully. Next slide. And there's also a rich diversity of wetlands also in near pristine conditions, ranging from large bogs like this one of the largest in northern Maine, fens and cedar seepage forests. And these are ecosystem types that occur primarily from here north. Next slide. And this is what they tend to look like on the ground, the bogs. And there's a lot of boreal species associated with those, both plants and animals. And there's also, next slide, wetland types that reach their northern limit in the region, like the silver maple floodplain on the Allagash. So it's a real interesting mix, and we haven't documented, but I'm willing to bet that the species diversity in terms of wetlands is incredibly high, probably, and we don't even know all the species that are there at this point. Next slide. And the North Maine Woods is home to a wide variety of mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and invertebrates. And many of the species that we think of when we think of the area are boreal. In addition to some of the ones shown, there's things like bog lemmings and a whole suite of birds that, like northern forest Canada jays, some you've probably seen and heard. And many of these require older forests or large habitat blocks and clean water, like there's a photo of a mussel gaping, actually filtering water. And freshwater mussels need clear water to survive, so they're really good indicator species. And so while this is a region of superlatives, and I could go on, a warming climate and changes in forest practices are impacting the ecological integrity of the North Maine Woods. And I've seen a lot of changes, especially in the last decade or two. from what the forest used to look like when I was younger. Next slide. And probably the biggest and still most nebulous set of suite of changes are associated with a warming climate. And this series of maps shows what's likely to happen, looking back 20 years and then up to mid-century roughly, and then to the end of the century. And if we stay on our current emissions trajectory, which looks more than likely now, the climate of the region will resemble that of central Maine by mid-century. That's in 2.5 decades. And southern Maine, York County, by the end of the century. So roughly an 8 to 10 degree temperature increase during that period. So that's going to obviously have profound influence on the region. Next slide. And we don't understand all of the implications, how this is going to affect forest ecosystems and wetland ecosystems and forest productivity, especially with regards to overall biodiversity. And we're already seeing a lot of species starting to move north and other ones moving in. But water temperature, drought and fire frequency, invasives, there's a whole suite of things that may be impacting how the forests function. And although one thing that people think is happening, more carbon dioxide tends to mean trees grow faster and other plants too, particularly invasives. Next slide. But what is happening with the climate is also being compounded by how water is being managed. This is Jazuncook Lake in 2021, which is a drought year, and it was drawing down so much water you could walk across certain coves. And so that's compounding the impacts of warming water, that type of thing. Next slide. So the implications for things that need cold, like cold water fish, boreal species, and really the region's forests, spruce, fir, are huge. Trout is a bellwether species because it's incredibly sensitive to temperature. Around 70 degrees, it's very stressful, and a little bit above that causes mortality. And there's already many portions of rivers and streams that are approaching that lethal threshold for trout. So that's a really good bellwether. And as a result, there have been some efforts in the Allagash and elsewhere to start to intensively monitor stream temperatures to look at what the trends are going to be, or what they are starting to be, have a baseline. Next slide. And there's a number of citizen science efforts and other efforts like the Breeding Bird Atlas, which just finished up, and Atlas is related to reptiles and amphibians and insects that are already documenting the northward movement of many species. For instance, even a couple decades ago, you didn't see cardinals overwintering in the North Maine woods, or bluebirds, or turkey vultures, or turkeys. There's a whole lot of species that have moved in. Painted turtles. When I was working in the Allagash, the first painted turtle ever seen anywhere along the waterway, we saw at the southern edge crossing the road to Chamberlain Lake. So things are moving. And if we pay attention, we'll have a better sense of what that means. But there's also a number of species like loons and chickadees that may not have suitable habitat by the time my grandkids are my age. And those are species that are predicted to slowly move north. Moose is another one. Next slide. Another dramatic change, but I think it's sort of been invisible to most people, is how forests are being managed. This is a typical lower elevation view of the forest. This is along the Allagash, and at first glance, all seems normal. A lot of trees as far as you can see. Next slide. But if you look closely, you can see that the forest no longer has all of its layers. If you look in the foreground, that's actually the Allagash waterway, the 500-foot strip that comprises the waterway. And you can see a very ragged canopy, with super canopy white pines, and it's just very uneven, which is typical of older stands. But if you look in the background, it doesn't look like that. It's very smooth. You don't see any super canopy trees. And that's pretty typical now. Next slide. And if you look at this from the air, this is what you see. And that's really what opened my eyes up to how much has changed, because I did 2 overflights from Augusta up to the St. John and back the other side, back to State Park. And what you can see is that the forest is much more homogeneous than it used to be. This is the type of management you see, whether it's wetland forest, upland forest, low elevation, high elevation, no matter what the stand type. This is what you see, and it's driven in part by machinery, that's a certain width and harvest in strips, like you see here. So the forest has become much more simplified. Rotations are pretty short, generally less than 60 years. On a lot of Irving's land, it's getting closer to 40 years. And that's not long enough for a forest to become a forest. Next slide. And there's also a growing number of acreage and plantations, and these are being, is that the slide, Ron?
Yes, it is. We're right on track.
Okay, good. And that tends to be planted, at least by certain of the larger landowners, with non-native species like Norway spruce or clones of native species. So again, the genetic diversity, the species diversity in a plantation is, it has a huge impact on biodiversity, obviously. And we know now, based on work done by John Hagan, that some of you might be familiar with, that less than 3% of Maine's forest is in a late successional old growth condition, which means 100 to 150 years and starting to acquire characteristics of older stands, things like, again, that uneven canopy, a lot of structural diversity, big limbs up top, ragged bark down below, a lot of downed logs on the ground, and the layers are there long enough, or the forest is not entered long enough to have suites of species come back, like those associated with a hardwood forest that has a canopy, spring ephemerals, for instance. Next slide. Another thing that's shifted, as I said, the forest management is the same pretty much whether it's wetland forest or upland forest. This is a large area of cedar. It actually looks pretty good, but it's pretty young, around a pond in the Allagash watershed. But wetland forests are now being harvested as intensively, and cedar is very valuable. So a lot of cedar forests are being cut very hard at the moment. Next slide. And I focus on cedar. It's a northern species, but it's incredibly important for keeping streams cool. If you look in a cedar forest, you'll often see this. You'll see water, groundwater, actually near the surface, but actually flowing underneath the forest. And the canopy keeps it cold in the summer, and then that feeds into streams, which provides the cold water habitat for a lot of aquatic species. And I did a lot of my field work in the Allagash barefoot, and I could tell where these were instantly. It's like an 8-degree temperature difference whenever I walked into one of these springs or seeps.
Wow.
Next slide. So this one has a few pictures, which I'll try to remember what they are. On the left is a classic cedar forest. It takes a long time for cedar to grow, very slow growing. And they often don't grow that well if you open up the canopy too much. So, if we cut them now, that plus the fact that they may not do as well as the temperature's warm, they may not come back. So I focus on cedar because I feel like it's sort of another bellwether tree. And our current forest practices laws and a number of other laws don't really protect wetland forests at all. You can harvest in them. There's nothing illegal about that. But as a result, there's a slide showing the peatland. That's Ellis Bog again. And you see this narrow buffer of black spruce and cedar, both wetland forest species. So you have ecosystems that aren't being managed as ecosystems because you're cutting all the wooded parts, but they're very much a part of the peatland system. So the function is altered over time, and we're not really documenting that, but you see that frequently. And then vernal pools, people don't have to inventory those. Even our Bureau of Parks and Lands doesn't necessarily inventory those, so they're not protected. You see that dark soil, I believe it's in the lower right. And that's where one of these processors that harvest wood went through and cut the trees. But you can tell that was a vernal pool just because that's the kind of soil the water accumulates in. And those are obviously important to a lot of reptiles and amphibians. So again, that's just because our current laws don't require that you manage around those. Next slide. So what I'm seeing when I work in the woods is a forest that's missing layers. You typically don't see what we call coarse woody material on the ground. Those, like I'm standing in an old downed tree that was obviously very big. And you can also see a big tree with lots of what we call epiphytes, lichens and mosses that grow on trees, and they need sort of the complex structure of bark to be able to survive, and the moisture of a stand that's not opened up to too much sun and wind. And these layers, and also the forest litter layer, down the soil layer under the trees is getting thinner because it decomposes quicker as it warms and more light. But these layers, the bark, the trees, the downed wood, and the soil sequester enormous amounts of carbon. And soils sequester much more than the trees themselves in a forest. So it's another area we haven't really looked at in terms of the impact on overall climate change, because obviously we want to be sequestering carbon. So overall, the forest structure has been simplified, younger. It looks pretty much the same most anywhere you go. And there's really no time for the overstory sapling and shrub species that are normally associated with mature forests to become established, because then it gets cut again before they can fill in. Next slide. And one of the first things that made me pay attention to this is when you work, this is actually a collection of sphagnum mosses primarily from a wetland, but when you walk in a spruce forest, like if you've been to Baxter, you probably noticed that you see this carpet of mosses on the ground. And there's no time for that moss layer to develop with the current forest management practices. And we have hundreds of species of mosses in Maine. We've not documented them all. And that, obviously helps keep the ground cool. It holds water in, it keeps forests cool. Mosses are really important for that. And there's a lot of values that we really haven't paid attention to. There's been no detailed inventories of mosses in the North Maine Woods, as far as I know. Next slide. And also when I'm traipsing through woods, especially northern hardwood forests, and some of you may notice in the spring, you get things like trillium and grape fern, blue cohosh, especially if it's say a northern hardwood forest. There's a lot of species that I used to see pretty much any time I'd go into a stand that was relatively old, and now I don't see them. And I think it's just they don't have time to move in from a source area in an older stand, and the older stands aren't close enough for them to move into. They call those refugia. And that's a big concern. We just don't have enough of these, what we call source areas or refuges, to repopulate stands that have been harvested. So the conditions in managed forests are no longer necessarily suitable for a whole suite of species. So the fact that we only have right now in Maine roughly 3% of the forest in the North Maine Woods, and we don't know what it is in the southern half of the state, is in a late successional old growth condition. And it's very uneven. Some townships have none. Some, like Baxter, have their bit, parts of the towns in Baxter. But they're far apart, and a lot of scientists, forest ecologists, are concerned that we could be facing something we call extinction debt. We're not quite seeing it yet, but because there's no time for species to move back in, we might be seeing a lot of species disappear. And this has already happened in Finland, where they've done intensive forestry for quite a while, and they're predicting they're going to lose roughly 50% of their species, and most of those are not the ones most people pay attention to, the mosses, the insects, the invertebrates. So we'll see. Next slide. So having said all this, nobody's, I'd say, really looking at how these changes might be affecting the integrity of the North Maine Woods, the ecological integrity. And there's a whole lot we don't know. And we've overlooked most species, and we, again, pay attention to the more charismatic ones. So, in my mind, the bottom line is we need to focus our efforts, whether it's conservation or management, more at the ecosystems and watershed scale, not just the portions that don't have much timber value, which is often what we do. We sort of minimize the width of the riparian zone, and we'll focus on one discrete natural communities or rare plant habitats, but that's not going to be enough to maintain those. And we obviously need to manage and restore additional forest land to maintain late successional forest characteristics. Everybody in the ecology world agrees that 3% is not enough to maintain all the species that are associated with older forests. And recommendations are a minimum of 10. The United Nations has recommended up to 17. We don't even have a hard and fast number there, but there's definitely agreement that 3% is too low. And we need to think about headwaters. There's a lot of concern now that the type of harvests I showed you could be impacting headwaters, the very headwaters of all these streams, by opening them up enough and frequently enough that temperatures will warm. But again, we don't have a lot of information on that. And then finally, I feel like probably the most important thing is to build the social will, make people aware, have them look a little more closely than you're on the top of a mountain and all looks well because there's lots of trees, but to really start to pay attention to some of the changes that are happening. So a case of education and also making people care. Now, end by saying there's a group of ecologists that have been getting together for about a year, considering doing another biodiversity assessment for the state of Maine. There hasn't been one done since the 90s. And we feel like it's fallen off the radar to some extent, biodiversity, and we all talk about it, but in terms of sort of the big trends, what makes a healthy forest or a healthy stream system, we don't really have a good handle on how forest management and climate change are impacting them now, although we can see that things are being impacted, but we need to really look more closely and identify what might need to change in order to keep native biodiversity thriving in the North Maine Woods. So anyway, it's a special place. I hope you get involved.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Janet. I think I know we all would have preferred to see you here, but I just learned a lot from that presentation, and I'm pulling back up the slide of you standing in the tree. So for anyone who wants a visual of Janet, right here in her natural habitat out in the North Woods. All right, I think we're gonna move on to Pete. Janet, are you gonna stick around on the phone or are you gonna jump off?
I can stay till 1 and
Okay.
I'll hang.
Awesome, great, because we have some questions coming in, so hopefully we have time to get to those. All right, I am gonna switch off of Janet's presentation and move over to Pete's. And Pete, I will just turn it right over to you.
Okay, great. I love that final picture, Janet, of you almost indistinguishable from the trees. So thank you very much for your career. Here's a quick zoomed out view just to remind folks of how unique and significant the Maine North Woods is in relationship to the rest of the eastern United States. Next slide. So as I've thought about how to organize the work that NRCM has done over the last 66 years, I decided that I'll just focus on a top 10 list of campaigns and projects that we've been involved with. And I'll go through these fairly quickly, 30 seconds or less for each. But every one of these really could be the subject of a book. And we have done this work with a huge number of people and organizations and allies, including many of you who are on this webinar today. So let me just start by thanking all of you. And what's going to connect all of these is NRCM has focused on protecting and conserving the integrity and character of the unique landscape of the North Woods. Next slide. It makes sense that I start with the Allagash. It's really the organization's origin story. This is our first newsletter, the NRC Bulletin, Volume 1, Number 1, about the Allagash. Next slide. It was a group of people that started NRC at the time. It was not NRCM, it was NRC. And the goal was to protect the Allagash Wilderness Waterway from a massive dam that would have created a huge impoundment, a 20,000 acre impoundment, Grand Allagash Lake, that would have had marinas, viewing towers, boat launches, campsites, nature trails, trailer parks, cottages, lodges, much more. It would have flooded most of the Allagash in 57 miles of the St. John. And NRCM was involved in the campaign that eventually resulted in the legislature passing a law to protect the Allagash Wilderness Waterway, and the people of Maine voting in 1966 to protect the Allagash Wilderness Waterway. Next slide. And in 1972, the 93-mile Allagash was the first state-run component of the National Wild and Scenic River system in the state. Next slide. NRCM also was very involved in the effort to defeat the Dickey-Lincoln Dam. It was a multi-decade effort. This was a public power project. It would have created an 88,000 acre impoundment on the St. John River. It would have had 2 dams, one of which would have been the 11th largest in the world. It was a $1.3 billion project, huge effort. It was generally supported by Maine's Democratic members of Congress, opposed by Republicans. It eventually was defeated in December of 1981 when Congress finally did terminate funding for the project. Next slide. The Bigelow Preserve is an extraordinary place, 35,000 acres. It was protected by the voters of Maine, who in 1976 passed a referendum. An organization, Friends of Bigelow, led the effort. NRCM was pleased to be part of it, to gather 55,000 signatures to put it on the ballot to direct the state to protect this extraordinary chain of 6 major peaks along the Appalachian Trail, 12 miles of it, from what was proposed to be the Aspen of the East. A Massachusetts corporation was going to build a 4-season resort on the backside that would have had a jet port, a marina on Flagstaff Lake, and a large ski area. Next slide. That's a picture from Bigelow. I'm sure that many who are watching this have been up on this ridge, and it's just awe-inspiring. Next slide. NRCM was very involved in the fight to defeat the Big A Dam, which was proposed in 1984 by a Great Northern paper. It was a $100 million concrete dam, would have been 15 stories on the big Abajac-Mockamus Falls. It would have inundated Ripigenis Gorge. We were part of a coalition to save the West Branch that received national attention, multi-year effort to demonstrate that the dam was not needed for its power or for the mills. And we succeeded in that effort when Great Northern terminated the project on March 13th, 1986, which was 39 years ago last week. Next slide. In September of 1990, the U.S. Congress passed the Maine Wilderness Act of 1990, which included designation of 11,000 acres as Maine's White Mountain National Forest wilderness area called Caribou Speckled Wilderness Area. This was a labor of love of Jerry Bly, who was an NRCM staff member at the time, who worked on this effort for 7 years and went to Congress to speak in support of it. And it's an extraordinary wilderness area with some fantastic hikes. Next slide. We also were pleased to work with Janet McMahon on her last Maine Forest Biodiversity Project effort. She spearheaded the effort in the 1990s to study and create the structure for an ecological reserve system. It was passed into law in 2000. We now have a system of ecological reserves that are conserving representative examples of the state's major habitat types. And it includes on public land, the Bigelow Preserve, Big Spencer, Dabooley, Namacanta, and many other of Maine's most iconic locations for backcountry recreation and ecological values. Next slide. Number 7 was the work that we did in partnership with Elliottsville Plantation, National Parks and Conservation Association, business and community leaders in the Katahdin region to help create the support for establishment by President Obama of the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. And that was in August of 2016. It's hard to believe that next year will be KWW's 10th anniversary. Next slide. This is a slide of what was proposed for the Plum Creek. This was going to be the largest development in Maine history. It was going to be 2,000 units across 975 house lots, 2 resorts, 3 RV parks. It would have permanently altered the Moosehead Lake region. The final outcome of that permitting process was 363,000 acres of conservation easement and a concept plan that Weyerhaeuser received when they purchased the land, but they never ended up pursuing any of the development. Next slide.
I think we got mixed up. We had
You got mixed up. You going backwards?
No, we had Moosehead, then Katahdin. You already talked about Katahdin. You just talked about Moosehead.
All right. Okay. So I guess my notes were mixed up. Okay, let's go to the big, so number 9, we protected Maine's public lands from a massive proposed increase in timber harvesting that was proposed, a 61% increase that would have happened. Kathy Johnson on our staff did a lot of investigative work in 2012 and got the legislature to reject a proposed increase that would have ended up substantially reducing the standing timber and older growth forests on public lands. This is a pretty significant effort to conserve some of the late successional and older growth woods within BPL's public reserve system. And then number 10 is the work that we've done on mineral mining in the North Woods. Through our work at the legislature to oppose weakening efforts of Maine's mineral laws, we ended up succeeding in putting into place the strongest mineral law in the nation. Nick Bennett really led the effort, working with Brownie Carson, who at that point was no longer NRCM's executive director, but instead was a state senator on the Environment and Natural Resources Committee. And that strict law helped defeat a proposal from Irving Corporation to develop the Bald Mountain mine. And then more recently, just this past year, we defeated Wolfton Resources' proposal for a metallic mineral mine in the North Woods. And that would also involved extraordinary number of people and partnerships with the Penobscot Indian Nation, Holton Band and Maliseets. And those tribal partners have been partners of ours on many of these projects through the decades. So why don't I stop there with our top 10 and pass it off to Luke.
Great, thanks, Pete. That was a great overview of the work that NRCM has been doing over the years in the North Woods. And now I'm going to talk about some of our priority legislation this session that's working to continue protecting the North Woods and the important special things that that Janet, the natural areas that Janet described. So next slide. So I'm going to be talking about 3 bills quickly that we're pursuing this session that deal with the North Woods. The first is a resolve to enhance the protection of high-value natural resources in the unorganized territory, and this is sponsored by Senator Rick Bennett from Oxford, and this has not been printed yet. The second is an act to study the future of outdoor recreational access in Maine. Again, this bill has not yet been printed and is sponsored by Russell Black out of Franklin County. And then finally, the third bill is LD 870, which is an act regarding the membership of the Maine Land Use Planning Commission. This is sponsored by Rep. Bill Briggio out of Augusta. And this bill has been printed and is up for a public hearing this Thursday, actually. Next slide. So I'm going to spend the bulk of the presentation today talking about that first bill, which is the resolve to enhance the protection of high-value natural resources. And the 2 resources that this bill specifically targets in protecting are 2 resources that are unique in Maine's North Woods, unique east of the Mississippi, and are really valuable. And those are older growth forests and remote undeveloped ponds. Next slide. So the process and the regulatory process of protecting the ponds in Maine's North Woods really began in 1987 with when Maine performed the Maine Wildland Lake Assessment, and this was an assessment that was performed by the Land Use Regulatory Commission, and they looked at the 1,500 lakes that are greater than 10 acres in the unorganized territories and looked at the resource values that these lakes have, as well as how they should be managed. Next slide. And so the way they looked at the resource values of these lakes is they looked at 7 different resources and across all 1,500 of these lakes, and decided that if one of the lakes met at least one of these resource values and it was considered outstanding of outstanding value, then that lake was classified as of statewide significance and was put in a resource class 1 is what they designated that. And if they found that one of these resource values was considered significant, at least one was considered significant, then they considered that lake of regional significance, and it was put in resource class 2. And then if they couldn't determine or it was unknown what the resource value was, then it was put in this third resource class 3. And so we're going to go to the next slide and take a look at what this looks like across the state. So here's a map showing the unorganized territories in Maine in the back in pink. And you can see the 3 resource classes shown here. So The green color represents resource class 1 of statewide significance. The orange is resource class 2 of regional significance. And then the red is the kind of the resource class 3 unknown significance. And so you can see 322 lakes are considered of statewide significance in resource class 1. And these are generally the larger lakes, which is why they represent about 82% of the area. And then accordingly, 559 lakes were in resource class 2. And these are smaller lakes, generally only representing 14% of area. And then the remaining 589 were put in resource class 3. So that deals with the resource classification of the lakes. And next, we're going to be talking about the management classification of the lakes. So as part of this process, in addition to resource class, each lake has assigned a management class, and that determines how development and other activities in the surrounding area should be permitted and done. And so just some management classes that I'm going to be focusing on is management class 1 and 6, and these are designated ponds that are remote and undeveloped. And so they're put in management class 1 and 6, and there are 202 of these lakes identified on the map here. And they are generally smaller lakes because they're remote and undeveloped. So these represent only 2% of the area, but have a lot of ecological significance. And then the other management classes, so there's management class 2 through 5, which represents developed lakes, and each lake has their own specific development prescriptions associated with it. And then the final class that I want to highlight is this management class 7, which is kind of a catch-all for all the other lakes that don't have a specific designated management class. And this accounts for 1,141 of the lakes and 64% of the area in terms of acreage. So a lot of these lakes don't have specific protection prescriptions. So we really wanted to look at these lakes that are in this management class 7 and decide, are there ones that are worthy of additional protections? Next slide. So I discussed management class 1 and 6, and the associated protections in terms of zoning that's associated with those is what's called a recreation protection zoning subdistrict. And so for management class 1 lakes, and here's an example of one in Upper Enchanted Township. Enchanted Pond and Little Enchanted Pond are both management class 1 lakes, and as a result, there's a quarter-mile no development buffer around them. And then a management class 6 lake, which McKinney Pond #1 is an example of, has a half-mile no development buffer around that. Next slide. So what this bill proposes to do is it directs the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry and the Land Use Planning Commission to look at those lakes and say that if there's a lake that's in management class 7 and it has resources that are considered of statewide significance, and it's currently still undeveloped within at least a quarter mile around it, that we think these lakes are deserving to be assigned in management class 1 and 6, and therefore will have that protection buffer around that. And so just to look at how this works out in theory, so you can advance next. Yeah, there's 1,500 lakes under LUPC management, and out of these 1,500 lakes, about 200 are currently in that management class 1 and 6, and like I said before, about 1,100 are in management class 7. And of these 1,140, there are 160 that are in resource class 1, and of these 160, there are currently only 50 that are still around 50 that are undeveloped. So what this bill does is essentially we'll put these 50 back into the 200 in the 200. You can advance one more, Kristen, and then so what that does, it'll increase by about 25% the number of lakes that are in management class 1 and 6 based on the analysis that we've done. So that's the lakes part of the bill. The next part of the bill is older growth forest, and so Janet mentioned that this study came out in October to protect older growth forests, and it used LiDAR to map where this older growth forest is in the unorganized territories. And so next slide, I'm going to talk about the methodology real quick. So this study used LiDAR, which is light detection and ranging, to determine the heights of trees throughout the unorganized territory, and it measures the difference in timing between light returning back to an instrument that's flown on an airplane. And so from that, in the top map here, you'll see a map of tree heights, and they're able to take this information of tree heights and run a random forest model and classify specific regions as not late successional old growth forest, transitional late successional forest, and then old growth like. And so the late successional forests is like Janet was mentioning, is the forests that are older than 100 years, as this diagram in the bottom left shows. And has a lot of important resources and characteristics that support wildlife. Next slide. And so this is just a figure and from the report, and I just want to quickly highlight. So they're able to use this data and map where this older growth forest is. And so from that, they're able to determine that 80% of the forest is not late successional forest. About 16% is transitioning into late successional forest. So it's starting to get older, starting to develop some of the forest characteristics, but only just under 3% is considered this late successional forest. And within that 3%, about 0.9% has characteristics that are very similar to old growth forests. So that just kind of gives you a sense of this was 30% of the unorganized territories was this late successional forest. It's now down to 3%. And they calculated in the study that the half-life of this is 35 years. So we have 3%, and we really need more to support biodiversity, but we don't want to lose this 3% that we have. So the bill that we're working on this session, next slide, will protect these forests by first developing a strategy, directing the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry to develop a strategy to protect these resources. And this isn't regulatory at this stage. We think at this stage, the report came out in October. We know where these forests are and how much we have it. That the time is to convene a diverse group of stakeholders to see what can we do to protect these resources, either land conservation, different zoning requirements, forest certification through FSC or SFI, as well as carbon markets and carbon credits to compensate landowners for keeping these trees standing. And the next part of this bill is that it currently in statute, there is a report that the department has to give every 5 years on the state of Maine of the state's forests. And so this essentially bill will just require that the department report on progress towards achieving this strategy to protect older growth forest. And then the final component of this bill is that it adjusts some of the priority framework within the Lands for Maine Future program to prioritize projects that protect older growth forest. Next slide. So that was that first bill. And the next bill I'll be talking about is an act to study the future of outdoor recreational access in Maine. And next slide. And across the state, we've been hearing, and there's a lot of concern about the loss of this great thing that we have in Maine, which is public access on private land. Maine's really unique in that we have this longstanding tradition. And so what this does is it convenes a stakeholder group to in a similar way as the other bill, of diverse stakeholders of varying interests, large landowners, various state agency representatives, as well as members of key outdoor recreation industries, to discuss this issue and see if there's any legislation that can be done to pursue it. And then this commission's allowed to submit legislation into it going forward. Next slide. And then finally, real quick, you've heard about all of these great resources and how important the unorganized territories in the North Woods are to the state. And so it's important that we manage them in accordance with this importance. So this third bill, LD 870, which is up for a public hearing, has to do with strengthening the Maine Land Use Planning Commission, which is the regulatory body responsible for regulating the unorganized territories. Next slide. And so what this bill does is it enhances the qualifications that the commissioners as part of the LUPC need to have. So it says that they need to have backgrounds in relevant industries, including forestry, conservation, wildlife biology, land use planning, recreation, and fisheries. And the second part of the bill is that it alters the appointment process for commissioners. So the Land Use Planning Commission, which used to be called the Land Use Regulation Commission, LURC, from 1971 to 2012. It consisted of 7 members appointed by the governor, and then in 2012 it was changed so that it was expanded from 7 members to 9 members, with 8 members elected by the 8 county commissioners that have the highest acreage in the UT, and then 1 appointment for the governor. And so what this bill proposes is adding additional 4 appointments for the governor, so expanding the commission to 13 members to provide more of that balance, because the UT makes up more than half the state, and it's what happens there impacts the state at large. So we believe that the governor should have be able to have more of a control over how the commission operates and what that work does. All right, I think next slide.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Luke. That was a lot of information. Thank you, Pete, for that history. Hopefully we'll have time for 1 or 2 questions, but before we get there, I wanted to mention different ways that you can stay engaged on these bills throughout the legislative session. The first is that we're hosting our annual State House Action Day on Tuesday, April 8th here in Augusta. And the North Woods bills, I think the late stage forest and the first bill that Luke talked about will be a focus for our State House Action Day. So that's a great chance to talk to your legislators. I'll drop the link to register for that event in the chat now. We also have weekly Take Action Tuesdays at the State House to have a chance to speak with your legislator on important bills. If you sign up for this webinar, hopefully you signed up for our email action alerts where you'll get updates on this as well. And then we have a bill tracking page and a Take Action toolkit on our website. That is a way you can track these bills and see where they're at in the process. I just chatted those to just the hosts and panelists, so let me chat the links this time to everybody. And then Janet, while we still have you, I'm going to throw one of the questions we got in the Q&A box over to you. Which was when you were talking about the plantations. Someone asked, are lumber companies planting for hardwoods and conifers in their plantations, or are these monospecific primarily?
Monospecific and usually conifers, again, Norway spruce and clones of spruce. And often they're growing them on what was hardwood land, not often, but sometimes. So yeah, a profound shift. It's sort of like what you would see if you go up to New Brunswick.
Great, thanks. We also had a question. I don't know if this is for you, Janet, or maybe for Pete or Luke, but someone asking what percentage of the North Maine Woods is not being forested? Just Baxter State Park, or are there other large preserves?
There's some ecological reserves, and the largest old growth is Big Reed Forest, which is about 5,000 acres. But there's ecological reserves. There's a number of them up in the north, and White Mountain National Forest. So there's, I don't know what percentage. I'm guessing it might add up to 5 or 6%. I should know that, but I can't. Off the top of my head, I don't know.
That's okay. The estimate works for us. Luke, we had this question in the chat. How would SFI fit into this? Their standard, sorry, just lost it, does not protect old growth, FSC does. Do you have an answer to that, or is that something we should follow up with to Edward?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think it could be looking at what current standards they have in there, and to see if there's anything that could be used, or maybe it could consist of outreach to them, saying that there are ways they could change their standards. But yeah, that's definitely something that you're right in that FSC does, and that's something that looking at how those can be applied in a meaningful manner is something that primarily that we're interested in, like as you point out.
And I could chime in on that too. I mean, the forest certification standards, require that you manage for biodiversity, but there's basically no metrics. And in terms of late successional, again, on some of the landowners in northern Maine, they define late successional as 80 years. There's not agreement on the definition, and they can manage in those. So, it's all over the place. But our certification programs do not protect late successional.
Gotcha. That's helpful. Okay, we are 1 minute left, so I know that wasn't a ton of time for Q&A, but we will be sending out a follow-up email that includes the recording and some other information on ways to take action. And if you have any lingering questions we weren't able to get to, feel free to reply with that there. But I want to take a moment to thank all of our presenters. Janet, especially, thank you so much for bearing with us and being here on the phone. Luke and Pete, thank you as always for your expertise. And thanks to all of our members and supporters for joining us here today, and happy to have you in this work to protect Maine's North Woods. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.